Imagine a 34-year-old soldier standing against some of the most powerful forces on Earth. Not just standing, fighting back, planning, and building something so massive that the entire Western world is stunned. This isn't the story of an ordinary man. This is the story of Captain Ibrahim Traore, the young leader of Burkina Faso who rose almost out of nowhere and began projects so daring, so shocking, that the West could no longer ignore him. When Traore came to power in 2022, many outside Africa thought he would be another temporary figure, a soldier with no vision. But what they didn't understand is that he was carrying the frustration of millions of Africans who were tired of living under the shadow of foreign control. Traore didn't just take the seat of power, he ignited a revolution. And the proof of that revolution is visible in the mega projects he has launched, 10 massive undertakings that are shaking the foundations of the old colonial order. Tonight, we're going deep inside those projects, one by one, starting with the first two that sent shockwaves through Europe and the United States. The first project is about something every nation desperately needs: energy. For decades, Burkina Faso remained in darkness. Entire villages lived without electricity, industries couldn't run, and schools and hospitals often shut down at night. The West knew this and they made sure to keep it that way. By controlling the flow of energy, they kept the country dependent. But Traore flipped the script. He announced a mega initiative to build solar and hydroelectric power plants across the nation. And not just small projects, massive facilities designed to power hundreds of thousands of homes. Now, here's the shocking part. Instead of signing the usual one-sided deals with Western corporations, Traore turned to alternative partners, nations willing to cooperate without strings attached. This bold move cut directly into the influence of France and other European powers. They weren't just surprised, they were furious. Because for the first time in decades, Burkina Faso was building a path toward real energy independence. Imagine the fear in the boardrooms of Paris and Brussels when they realized their grip was slipping. But it wasn't only about energy. Traore knew that without food security, no nation could stand tall. And so came the second mega project, an agricultural revolution. Burkina Faso, like much of Africa, has some of the most fertile land on Earth, yet the country imported food it could easily grow itself. Why? Because foreign policies, corruption, and lack of investment kept farmers powerless. Traore decided that era was over. He launched programs to give farmers access to modern technology, tractors, irrigation systems, and training. Entire regions that once struggled with food shortages are now on the path to becoming self-sufficient. This agricultural project did more than feed people. It sent a clear message to the world: Burkina Faso will not be a market for Western agribusiness giants to dump their products. Instead, it will feed its own people and maybe even export to its neighbors. For the West, this was more than shocking. It was dangerous. Because if one African nation could do it, others could follow. And that could shatter the global system of dependency built over centuries. Think about it. In just a short time, Traore tackled two of the most critical issues: power and food. Energy independence and agricultural self-sufficiency. These are the foundations of a free nation. Without them, no country can claim to be sovereign. With them, Burkina Faso began to stand tall in ways no one expected. And this is just the beginning. Because as we move deeper into Traore's top 10 mega projects, the scale becomes even more unbelievable. From controlling natural resources to rebuilding military power, from infrastructure to education, the list goes on. And every single project has one thing in common: it weakens the grip of foreign powers while strengthening the backbone of Burkina Faso. But before we get there, let's pause on what we've already seen. Imagine the reaction in Western capitals as reports poured in. A young African captain pushing through massive solar farms and modernizing agriculture. For decades, leaders in those same capitals had repeated the story that African nations couldn't manage such projects without their help. Yet here was proof that they were wrong. And not only wrong, but exposed. Traore isn't just building projects. He is building a new narrative, one where African nations can rise on their own terms. And that is the real reason the West is shocked. Because these aren't just roads, power plants, or farms. They are symbols of independence. So what comes next? If energy and food security were enough to rattle the old order, wait until you hear about how Traore moved to take back control of Burkina Faso's gold and mineral wealth, or how he began reshaping education and infrastructure in ways that no one thought possible. The list of mega projects isn't just impressive, it's revolutionary. And as we continue, you'll see why the name Ibrahim Traore has become both a beacon of hope across Africa and a nightmare for the powers that once controlled it. By the time Ibrahim Traore had launched his energy and agriculture revolutions, Whispers had already started spreading through Western corridors of power. Analysts, journalists, even government officials in Paris and Washington were quietly asking, what exactly is happening in Burkina Faso? But the real shock came when Traore touched the single most sensitive nerve of all, the nation's gold and mineral resources. Burkina Faso is rich, not poor. That's the truth the world rarely hears. Beneath its soil lies enormous reserves of gold, manganese, zinc, and other precious minerals. For decades, these resources flowed quietly into the hands of foreign corporations. Multinational companies signed contracts that gave them near total control, while Burkina Faso itself was left with scraps, barely enough to develop, let alone thrive. This was the heart of neocolonialism, the wealth of Africa feeding the economies of Europe. Traore knew this and he wasn't afraid to act. One of his boldest megaprojects was the national reclamation of gold mines. He began reviewing, renegotiating, and in some cases outright canceling the exploitative contracts that handed over natural wealth to outsiders. Suddenly, Western mining firms, who had grown used to unchallenged profits, were in panic. Reports claimed that Traore insisted on a minimum of 90% of profits remaining in Burkina Faso. Compare that with the old deals where barely 20% stayed in the country. Imagine the ripple effect. Billions of dollars in potential revenue redirected from Europe back to Africa. For the West, this wasn't just shocking, it was dangerous. Because if Burkina Faso could pull this off, other African nations sitting on diamonds, oil, and minerals might follow the same path. But it didn't stop there. Traore announced that these resources would not just be exported raw anymore. Instead, he planned to build domestic processing facilities, refineries, smelters, and factories, so that Burkina Faso could export finished products, not just raw materials. That single move could flip the economic balance of power. Why? Because raw resources are cheap, finished products are valuable. For centuries, the West thrived on that imbalance. Traore was about to destroy it. As if that wasn't enough to shake the system, he moved on to another project, the military transformation of Burkina Faso. For decades, Burkina Faso's army was weak, underfunded, and heavily reliant on support from Western nations. That support often came with strings attached, training programs, military aid, or weapons deals that ensured dependency rather than strength. But Traore understood one brutal truth: no nation can protect its sovereignty if it cannot defend itself. So, he launched a massive initiative to rebuild the armed forces. This wasn't just about buying more weapons, it was about restructuring the entire military system. Local recruitment surged. Young men and women volunteered in record numbers, inspired by the vision of a truly independent Burkina Faso. The government invested in training, logistics, and strategy. More importantly, Traore sought out partnerships with nations outside the traditional Western sphere, giving his military access to modern equipment without bowing to old colonial demands. The West watched in disbelief. For years, they had insisted that African nations needed their protection, their bases, their advisors. But here was Burkina Faso, building a self-reliant army, one loyal not to foreign powers but to its own people. It was a direct threat to the entire security architecture that France, the US, and NATO had built across the Sahel region. And then came the third mega-project of this part: infrastructure development. For a long time, the very roads of Burkina Faso told the story of neglect. Poorly built highways crumbled, bridges collapsed, and rural areas remained cut off from cities. This wasn't an accident, it was the design of a system that kept African nations fragmented and dependent. But Traore made infrastructure a central pillar of his vision. Massive roadworks began, linking remote villages to economic hubs. Plans for modern rail systems connecting Burkina Faso to neighboring states were introduced. Airports were upgraded not just for foreign access but to serve the needs of the people. And in the heart of the capital, Ouagadougou, construction projects surged: new hospitals, government centers, and even housing initiatives that gave ordinary people hope. What shocked the West wasn't the construction itself, it was the speed. Within months, visible progress began to emerge. Bulldozers worked day and night. Entire highways rose from the dust. International observers noted that Traore wasn't wasting time on endless feasibility studies or foreign consultants. He was mobilizing local labor, local companies, and regional partners. Burkina Faso was proving that it didn't need Western contractors charging millions of dollars for projects that never finished. By now, the pattern was clear. Every project Traore launched had two effects: it empowered his people and it reduced foreign influence. Energy independence, agricultural revolution, reclaiming resources, building the military, and constructing infrastructure. 5 massive blows to the old system. And the world was paying attention. Western media outlets began labeling Traore as controversial, radical, even dangerous. But among ordinary Africans, his popularity soared. Social media lit up with videos, songs, and speeches praising him as the new face of African liberation. In markets and streets, people whispered his name with pride. For the first time in decades, they saw a leader who wasn't afraid to defy the so-called powers of the world. And here lies the real shock. Because for centuries, Africa's story was written by others. Its wealth was stolen, its leaders often controlled, its future dictated. But through these mega projects, Traore was writing a new story, a story of ownership, pride, and independence. As we move forward, the picture becomes even more dramatic. Because what comes next are projects that go beyond economics and security, they touch the very soul of the nation. Education, culture, technology, and regional alliances. These aren't just policies. They are a blueprint for a new Africa. And for the West, they are a nightmare taking shape in real time. If energy, food, minerals, and military strength shook the West, what came next went even deeper, into the minds and hearts of the people. Ibrahim Traore understood something many leaders before him overlooked. True independence is not only about resources or armies. It is about knowledge. It is about how people think, how children grow, and how future generations see themselves. And that's why his next mega project was nothing less than an education revolution. For decades, Burkina Faso's education system followed the colonial blueprint. Curriculums were designed in France, textbooks carried foreign perspectives, and students often left school knowing more about European history than their own. Traore saw this as a silent weapon, because a nation that doesn't know its own history cannot stand proudly in the future. So, he launched an initiative to rewrite and rebuild the education system from the ground up. The focus shifted toward African history, African science, and African culture. Instead of teaching children that success meant leaving their homeland for Europe, the new vision taught them to see value in staying and building their country. Schools began emphasizing practical skills, agriculture, engineering, medicine, so that young people could directly contribute to national growth. And here's where the West was shocked. Traore didn't just stop at changing the curriculum. He pushed for free and accessible education for as many children as possible, investing state funds to build schools in remote areas that were ignored for decades. Imagine the power of that. Villages that had never seen a classroom suddenly witnessing children holding textbooks with their own culture reflected inside. For the West, this was alarming because a generation raised with pride and knowledge is a generation that cannot be controlled. But Traore didn't stop at education. He knew that in the modern world, knowledge is power, but technology is control. And for far too long, Africa's digital world was dominated by foreign companies, foreign servers, and foreign platforms. The next mega project was all about technology and digital independence. This was daring, almost unthinkable in the eyes of Western observers. Burkina Faso began working on building its own digital infrastructure: data centers, local networks, and cyber defense systems. The goal was clear: to make sure that the country's information, communication, and online economy would no longer be entirely in the hands of outsiders. Think about it. Every email, every online transaction, every piece of data in most African nations flows through servers controlled by Western companies. That means surveillance, influence, and manipulation at the push of a button. But Traore wanted a future where Burkinabe citizens could communicate, learn, and innovate on platforms that weren't monitored by outsiders. Along with this, his government encouraged youth-driven tech initiatives, coding schools, innovation hubs, and startups. The message to the young people was simple: don't just consume technology, create it. That idea alone was explosive. Because if African youth began creating technology, apps, and platforms, they wouldn't just serve their own markets. They could compete globally. For the West, which has long thrived on being the sole supplier of high-tech products, this was a genuine threat. And then came perhaps the most powerful project of them all, the project of regional unity. Traore knew that Burkina Faso by itself was still small compared to the giants of global politics. But together with neighbors, together with Africa as a whole, they could be unstoppable. That's why one of his greatest undertakings was forging Pan-African alliances. He reached out to Mali, Niger, Guinea, and other nations that shared a similar vision of independence. Talks of military cooperation, economic integration, and cultural exchange began taking shape. Joint defense agreements were discussed, new trade routes planned, and a shared political voice started to emerge. This wasn't just talk, it was action. And it was happening faster than anyone in the West expected. The idea of a united African bloc, independent, resource-rich, militarily capable, and technologically advancing, sent shivers through Western capitals. For centuries, the strategy had been to divide African nations, pit them against each other, and weaken them through artificial borders. Traore was undoing that strategy step by step. And here's the deeper shock. It wasn't just about politics. It was about identity. Traore spoke openly about Africa being one civilization, one family, one destiny. His speeches electrified crowds, not only in Burkina Faso but across the continent. Millions of Africans began to see themselves not as isolated citizens of small, struggling nations, but as part of a rising giant. From classrooms teaching African history to servers storing African data, to military pacts uniting African states, the message was the same. The era of dependency is ending. For the West, this was almost unthinkable. Imagine the nightmare of losing not just one African nation, but entire regions. Nations once considered weak suddenly standing tall together. It wasn't just shocking, it was terrifying for those who had built empires on African wealth. By this point, the list of mega-projects was already enough to prove that Traore wasn't just a temporary leader, he was a visionary. But the story doesn't end here. Because there were still more projects underway, projects tied to culture, healthcare, and the international stage. And those, perhaps, are the ones that reveal just how far Traore's vision really goes. The young captain wasn't only leading a country, he was leading a movement. And the world was watching in disbelief. By the time Ibrahim Traore had transformed energy, food, resources, the military, infrastructure, education, technology, and regional alliances, many thought he had already done enough to etch his name in history. But the young leader wasn't done. He understood that true independence goes deeper. It touches the soul of a nation. That's why his next mega-project focused on something most leaders ignore: cultural revival. For decades, African culture in Burkina Faso had been overshadowed by Western influence. French was the language of government, European traditions shaped public life, and African identity was often portrayed as secondary or even primitive. Traore knew this was a weapon of psychological control. A people who forget their culture forget their power. So he made cultural revival a central mission. Festivals celebrating Burkinabe traditions were revived and expanded. Schools were encouraged to teach local languages alongside French, ensuring children grew up connected to their heritage. Traditional music, art, and storytelling were funded by the state, not as entertainment but as pillars of national pride. Museums and cultural centers began rising, showcasing the long history of the Mossi Empire and other local civilizations. To the West, this might have seemed small, but in reality, it was a direct challenge to centuries of cultural dominance. Traore was telling his people, "You don't need to imitate anyone. You are enough. Your culture, your history, your values, they are your strength." That single shift in mindset created something powerful. A nation that no longer looked outward for validation but inward for identity. And then came the mega project that touched every family: the push for healthcare reform. Burkina Faso has long struggled with weak healthcare systems. Hospitals were underfunded, doctors were few, and medicines were often imported at high prices. Many rural communities had little to no access to basic health services. Traore attacked this head-on. He launched projects to build new hospitals and clinics, particularly in rural areas. Medical training programs were expanded, with scholarships offered for young students to study medicine and return to serve their people. Most shocking for the West was his push to reduce dependence on foreign pharmaceutical companies. Traore encouraged local research into traditional medicine, blending modern science with African knowledge. Plans for small-scale pharmaceutical production inside Burkina Faso were introduced, so that the nation could begin producing its own essential drugs. This was revolutionary, because for decades, Africa has been one of the largest markets for Western pharmaceutical giants. A shift toward self-reliance threatened billions in future profits. To ordinary Burkinabe families, however, it meant hope. It meant mothers no longer walking miles for treatment. It meant children surviving illnesses that once claimed too many lives. And then, as if that wasn't enough, Traore set his sights beyond Burkina Faso's borders with his final mega-project: international diplomacy on Africa's own terms. For years, Burkina Faso had been treated as a junior partner on the world stage, invited to summits only to listen, rarely to decide. But Traore flipped the script. He began forging new alliances with nations outside the Western orbit, strengthening ties with Russia, China, Turkey, and other partners willing to respect African sovereignty. At the same time, he pushed for stronger African representation in global forums. He demanded that Africa have a voice in shaping decisions on climate, trade, and security. And he did this not as a beggar seeking aid, but as a leader representing a continent rising from centuries of exploitation. Western diplomats were stunned. Here was a leader from one of Africa's poorest countries speaking with the authority of a global statesman. Here was a man who, within just a short period, had built a model that could inspire the entire continent. By now the picture is clear. Ibrahim Traore's top 10 megaprojects aren't just construction projects, policies, or reforms. They are a declaration of war against the system that kept Africa weak. Energy independence, agricultural self-sufficiency, reclaiming resources, military strength, infrastructure growth, education reform, technological independence, regional unity, cultural revival, healthcare and diplomacy. Each one is a weapon, not of destruction but of liberation. And that's why the West is shocked. Because these aren't just projects, they are cracks in the walls of an empire. Cracks that grow larger every day, threatening to bring down a system built on African submission. But for the people of Burkina Faso, these projects are something else. They are hope. They are dignity. They are proof that even a small nation, led by a determined vision, can stand against giants and refuse to bow. So, when history is written decades from now, maybe the story won't be about France or America or Europe. Maybe it will be about a young captain who dared to dream bigger for his people. And maybe, just maybe, it will be about how that dream spread across a continent and changed the world. Because sometimes revolutions don't start with guns. Sometimes they start with schools, farms, hospitals, and courage. And that, more than anything, is why Ibrahim Traore has shocked the West. If you've been inspired by this journey into the bold vision of Ibrahim Traore and the mega projects shaping Africa's future, don't stop here. There's more to uncover, more truths hidden behind headlines, and more stories the world doesn't want you to hear. This is Vision Rise 24. Make sure you hit subscribe, share this video with those who need to see it, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters in this conversation. Together we rise.